Alright, hi everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. So this is going to be our last lecture video of the semester. This certainly wasn't the way that I had planned to finish up our semester with lecture videos, but I hope that this transition has been as smooth as possible, and if you guys need anything, let me know. So what's going to be happening is that I'm going to be posting this lecture video that is for the week of April 13th. This will be our last lecture video, although I am planning on doing a review video for Exam 4 just like I did for Exam 3, so there will be that other review video, but today is the end of the new information. So this video has an activity associated with it. Activity 12 is going to be due by 5 p.m. on April 17th. Now remember that I'm going to drop your two lowest activity grades. So if you reach this point and you already have credit for 10 activities, then there's no reason as far as your grade is concerned to complete this activity. Although if you can, if you want to, that's fine. So I'm going to keep your top 10 activities. Any extra credit that you have, I did put up an extra credit for Exam 4, and I have it closing at the same time that Exam 4 closes. The extra credit question was asking you to give me your thoughts about the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. So some of the things we talked about that supported that hypothesis, some of the things we talked about that went against that hypothesis. So in addition to getting extra credit for that, that will also help you as you start to prepare for Exam 4. So Exam 4 is going to open at 8 a.m. on April 13th for both sections. It's going to close at the end of the final exam period for your particular section. So this that I have pulled up right now is for my 8 o'clock section. So if you're in my 8 o'clock class, it's going to close at 11 a.m. on April 24th. That's the end of your final exam period. If you're in my 11 o'clock section, it's going to stay open until 3 p.m. on April 29th, at the end of your final exam period. And your schedule for your particular section is posted for you in Canvas, okay? So Exam 4 is going to be multiple choice, true, false, and fill in the blank. And I do have the study guide posted for you on Canvas, and I will be posting a review video as well. The grades on Exam 3 went up quite a bit. The previous couple of exams, the average had been hovering in the 67-ish range, but the average for Exam 3 was an 80, and that was not including the extra credit points that will get put into your final grade, but that were in a separate column in the grade book, versus with the first two exams, the extra credit was already added in. So having the exams online, there was a significant boost in the grades. So I'm expecting that you guys will do well on Exam 4. Also, do remember though that I'm going to have to go in and check the fill in the blank to make sure that you got appropriate credit for everything. So your grade might go up after you take the test and I go through and check the fill in the blank. Okay. You'll see this in the review video, but Exam 4 is going to cover chapters 16, 17, and 19. Okay. So in this class, we keep your top 10 activities, keep your extra credit points, and then your 4 exams. So after you take Exam 4, you are done with my class. If you need more activity points, do Activity 12. If you want to do the extra credit for Exam 4, you can do that as well. But Exam 4 is going to be the last real thing you do for this class. So let me know if you have any questions about any of these announcements. So Chapter 19 is about language and lateralization. And there's a reason why we put these two together, which I'll get at in just a second. But when we're talking about language, we know that there are many different species that communicate. And they communicate in a lot of different ways. Maybe they communicate with smells. We talked about pheromones. Maybe they communicate with certain behaviors. You can think about bees doing a waggle dance to tell other bees where the honey is and that kind of thing. But also, when it comes to language, we're going to see that humans may be alone in communicating via language. There has been some research in teaching things like sign language to primates, but for the most part, we think of language as being an exclusively human thing. So when we say language, we're talking about a system of arbitrary symbols. When we talk about arbitrary symbols, we made these up. Okay? and we assigned meaning to certain words. And so, of course, different languages have different words for different items, different concepts. So they're highly specialized based on the type of language that they're talking about. You assemble them and reassemble them. So you learn the tiny parts first, right? A says ah, that kind of thing. And then you're able to put all of that together once you know all the letters and all the sounds. You get the phonics. You put all those together to read words, right? So you can combine these letters into lots of different words, different phrases, different sentences that can express a lot of different concepts to other people, can express concepts to people who are not born yet. We can write things down for future generations to find. Now, when we're talking about language, the term grammar technically refers to the rules for how we use language. And so different languages will have different rules about how language should be used. Grammar may not necessarily be the most exciting subject that the majority of us study, but it is very important. And yes, I do make my kids diagram sentences, in case any of you guys are wondering. All right, but I don't make you guys diagram sentences, so there's something to be thankful for. Okay, so I said that this chapter was on language and lateralization. Language is a really great example of lateralization, and a lot of the research on lateralization has focused on individuals who've had some type of impairment in the language area. So that's why we put these two things together. When we say lateralization, we're talking about the fact that your right and left hemispheres are specialized. So you have the right half of your brain and left half of your brain that look really similar to each other, but they're not exact copies. There are some structures that differ from the left and the right side of the brain, and they seem to have different purposes. So we'll talk about some tasks that involve more of the left brain, some tasks that involve more of the right brain. But one thing to note is that this concept that you can be right-brained or left-brained, and you can tell whether a person is right-brained or left-brained based on their personality and their behavior. There's no real research to support that. So maybe you've taken a quiz sometime, or somebody said, oh, you're so creative, you must be left-brained, or whatever. I don't really even know what the stereotypes are, but there's no research to support that. You are whole-brained, unless you're one of the few individuals that has an issue with your corpus callosum, which we're going to be talking about in a second. You're whole-brained. Your right hemisphere and your left hemisphere are communicating with each other, and you're using both of them. So while I am saying that your right hemisphere and left hemisphere have different specializations, I'm not saying that one particular person's personality differs from somebody else's because they're more right or left-brained. Okay, now, when we're studying specializations in the brain, in the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, that's actually hard to do because the hemispheres communicate with each other, and they communicate very quickly, so that if the right half of the brain is doing something, it's hard to tell, because the right and the left side are communicating so quickly, you can't necessarily know for sure in most normal situations which half of the brain is doing what. So what we're going to have to do is study situations where the left and right hemisphere cannot communicate with each other well, and that's how we'll find out more, or that's one major way, that we'll find out more about what the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain can do. So when we're talking here about the hemispheres being connected, they're connected by that corpus callosum. And I think we've mentioned this before, but there are some individuals who've had their corpus callosum severed to stop seizures from happening. So if you have seizure activity that's happening in one side of the brain and then spreading to the other side of the brain, if you sever the corpus callosum, then the individual will continue to have the seizure activity in the hemisphere where it originates, but it won't be able to spread, and so the symptoms will become less severe. This is obviously not the treatment you go to first. There are a lot of great medications. My daughter takes one medication for seizures. So there are lots of other treatment options out there. This is actually extremely rare. I'm not sure that this kind of surgery is being done anymore, but it has been done. And for the individuals who had this surgery done, it really worked well at helping them with their seizure symptoms. But there were other problems that came up, as you can imagine, when you sever this corpus callosum. Okay? You're also going to see coming up in a future slide that some individuals, very rarely, are born without a corpus callosum. So it could be that the corpus callosum is severed intentionally during surgery, or it could be on rare occasion that an individual is born without a corpus callosum. But when you see this split brain research, that's talking about studying individuals that have had the corpus callosum severed. So this research has been done in animals, as you can imagine, and then we know a little bit about this in humans because of those individuals who'd had that surgery to help with seizures. But it's a very small sample size in humans. So bearing that in mind, your textbook talks about Sperry, who was the researcher who was studying this in humans who had had the corpus callosum severed, not for the purpose of this research study, but to try to prevent symptoms of seizures. Okay. Now, you'll see some pictures of this in a second, but what they did was they presented words to a particular visual field, knowing that your left visual field is going to communicate with the right hemisphere, and your right visual field is going to communicate with the left hemisphere. Okay. Now, you're going to see a picture of this in a second, but in a typical individual, that doesn't make that much of a difference, because if something comes in through your right hemisphere, it comes into your right visual field and goes to your left hemisphere, then in a typical functioning person, that information will cross the corpus callosum and also go to the right hemisphere. So usually this is not an issue. But if a person has had this split brain surgery, then information that comes in through their right visual field and goes to the left hemisphere would not be shared with their right hemisphere because that corpus callosum is severed. So what we're going to see here is that the language ability for the majority of people, later you'll see this is not necessarily for everyone, but for the majority of people, language ability seems to be prevalent on the left side of the brain, the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere does a lot of other important things. It talks about the emotional tone of language. You'll see that come up again later. More of a nonverbal cue there, as well as attention, spatial processing, following a map, recognizing faces, that kind of thing, seems to be specialized in the right hemisphere. Okay, so we skipped the chapter on vision, so without going into any great detail here, okay, you have left visual field and your right visual field, and you can see the way that this works. Like, your right visual field is not just received by your right eye, it's received by this particular portion of your right eye and this particular portion of your left eye. And you have your left visual field, that is this particular portion of your left eye and this particular portion of your right eye. Okay, so what you need to be seeing here is that information that comes in through your right visual field is going to go first to your left hemisphere, but then it will be shared with the right hemisphere. Information comes in through your left visual field, it will go first to your right hemisphere, but then because this person has an intact corpus callosum, it will be shared with the left hemisphere. So that's what you see here. You see this individual who looks at a picture of a key, and they say, "What is this?" And the person says, "Key." How do they know it's a key? Well, this picture was placed, or this item was placed, in their left visual field. So it came in through the left visual field, so it went to the right hemisphere. Now, the right hemisphere is not specializing in language for the majority of people, but because this person has an intact corpus callosum, this information can travel through the corpus callosum to the left hemisphere to the language centers, and so this happens really quickly. The information is shared, and the person can say key. Now, that's for an individual who has an intact corpus callosum. What about our split brain individual? So a person who's had their corpus callosum severed. So what we see here is that there is a picture of a key, or an actual key here, and it's placed in this person's left visual field. They have the other eye covered up to try to prevent it from interfering here, but we have this key only coming in through the left visual field, which means that it will go to the right hemisphere. Now, because this individual's corpus callosum is severed, it's not going to be able to share that information from the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere. Because of that, the person can't think of the right word for the key. So it went to the right side of the brain, couldn't get to the left side of the brain, and the person couldn't name it. So that tells us the left side of the brain is needed for language tasks. Over here, we have the key, and it's lined up where it's in the person's right visual field. Now, if you're going to be in your right visual field, then it's going to send that information to your left hemisphere, where the majority of people have their language centers, and because of that, the person will be able to say, oh, that's a key. So it seems strange that moving this object from one position to the next makes a difference about whether or not the person is able to think of the name of the object, but it's where is this information being sent? Is it being sent directly to the left hemisphere? Great, I can answer the question. But if it's being sent to the right hemisphere and then the right hemisphere can't share that information with the left hemisphere, the person can't think of the key. So the take-home message here is that split brain individuals show us that for the vast majority of people, and there's other research to support this as well, the majority of people have their language centers in the left hemisphere. Now, as I said, there are some people who are born partially or totally lacking a corpus callosum. This is callosal agenesis. Now, one thing to note is that this particular type of issue often comes with other symptoms as well. So a person who has this kind of major developmental issue in the brain probably has other issues as well. So when we say here that these individuals tend to have fewer symptoms, it's fewer symptoms that are related to the corpus callosum issue. They could have other issues as well. But what seems to happen here is that if you have an intact corpus callosum, and then as an adult you have it severed, it's hard for your brain to bounce back from that. But if you're an individual who was, from the very beginning of development, not having a corpus callosum, then it seems like your nervous system is able to compensate for that in some way. The neuroplasticity takes over, and so these individuals don't see as many symptoms as the person who has this happen to them in adulthood. So this is going to be seen again towards the end of this set of slides when some individuals have had all or a large portion of a hemisphere removed, that when this kind of thing happens earlier in development, you have better outcomes, versus if it happens later in life, it's usually harder to bounce back from that. Okay. Other ways we've studied the specializations of the two hemispheres of the brain. A dichotic presentation. Now, to me, I can struggle a little bit with attention, and this just seems like this would be extremely frustrating to me if I was a participant in this kind of research. But what they do is they put on headphones on the individual, and they play different sounds in each ear. There's one sound coming in the right ear, one sound coming in the left ear. I think there's a picture of this that you'll see in a second as well. So what they're going to do is ask you to try to remember the sounds. And with two different sounds coming in at the same time, they're competing with each other. What they found is that some individuals have a right ear advantage. Now, there seems to be a relationship with handedness here, which we're going to talk a little bit more about handedness coming up. But right-handed individuals, as you'll see later, are especially likely to have their language centers on the left side of their brain. So what we're saying is that the information coming in the right ear is being sent to the left hemisphere. And for the majority of people, especially the majority of right-handed people, their language centers are on the left side of the brain. So if you play two different noises, they will probably remember the one that came in through their right ear because it went to their left hemisphere where the language centers are located. Okay? Now, you'll see in a second that if you only have one sound coming in at a time, it doesn't matter which ear it's coming in. And assuming you don't have hearing problems, you'll process it just fine. This is happening when you have two different sounds coming in at the same time. Most right-handed people will have this right ear advantage, and some left-handed people will as well. 50% of left-handed individuals have a left ear advantage. So what we're saying is that, and you'll see this later, about 90% of the population is right-handed. And then about 50% of the left-handed, so about 50% of the 10%, so about 5% of people are having a left ear advantage, which means then that their language centers may be more located on the right side of the brain. Okay. So, as we're saying, right ear advantage, the information coming in through the right ear is going to be sent first to the left hemisphere. So you have a right ear advantage that suggests that person may have their language centers on the left side of the brain. Okay? Now, as I said, this is only evident in simultaneous presentations. If your brain has to choose between two different noises, one coming in through your left ear and one coming in through your right ear, it will prioritize the message that is sent to your language centers. And so a message coming in the right ear will be sent to the left hemisphere. For most people, that's where their language centers are located. But one other thing that's interesting is they found that this was only the case for consonants and not the case for vowels. I don't know why. That's just what the research says. Okay, so here's a picture. I feel like the pictures can be helpful here. Okay. This person is hearing one sound. They have meh coming into their left ear. Okay, now, assuming that this person has their language centers on the left side, which the majority of people do, what's happening is that this sound, meh, is coming in through the left ear, so it will be sent to the right hemisphere. But because this person has an intact corpus callosum, that information will be shared with the left hemisphere, and they'll be able to report the sound that they heard. This is not a dichotomous presentation. There's only one sound coming in. Here, once again, only one sound coming in, so not a dichotomous presentation. We have the pa sound coming into this ear. So that sound comes into the right ear, which means it's going to be sent to the left hemisphere, where most people have their language centers, and so the person is easily able to report the sound that they heard. But here we have a dichotomous presentation, where we have the meh sound coming in the left ear and the pa sound coming in the right ear. So the meh sound comes in the left ear, goes to the right hemisphere, and then goes to the left hemisphere, which can only happen if the person has an intact corpus callosum. But this is not split brain research. This person has an intact corpus callosum. So the meh comes in the left ear, goes to the right hemisphere, gets sent to the left hemisphere to the language centers. The pa comes in through the right ear, so it goes straight to the left hemisphere. Because of that, there's an advantage because this message is going to reach the language center more quickly. It doesn't have to cross over the corpus callosum from one hemisphere to the next like the meh had to do. So because of that, if you have your language centers on the left side of your brain, as the majority of, not all, but the majority of people do, then you will probably have a right ear advantage. Okay? Now, that's talking about your sense of hearing. What about vision? So we did something somewhat similar with a tachistoscope. There we go. Try saying that 3 times fast. Tachistoscope test. All right, so they use this apparatus that is going to present information to either the left or right visual field. So this is somewhat similar to what we did earlier when we were talking about showing the key and keeping it only in the right visual field or only in the left visual field. So what we're doing that now is we're showing certain types of information. So we could show words and letters. That could be one option. Or we could show shapes and faces. That could be another option. What they found is that for most people, the left hemisphere is going to have the best, why can I not think of the right word? My left hemisphere is not firing. The best results. It's going to be the most effective. It's going to work better. There we go. Okay. I haven't had enough caffeine or a nap, by the way. I want you guys to appreciate I'm skipping a nap. My toddler is asleep right now, but I'm recording because I care about you guys. All right. So the left hemisphere is going to be able to recognize words and letters more efficiently. So the left hemisphere is going to be receiving information from the right visual field. So remember, the right visual field sends information to the left hemisphere. The left visual field sends information to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere showed better recognition of faces, geometric shapes. So later we'll talk about how some individuals have difficulty recognizing faces, even recognizing their own face, which would be really unpleasant. So other research that has been done in this area, trying to study the specialization of the two hemispheres, has focused on auditory areas of the brain. So in particular, you see a large difference in the size of the planum temporale between individuals. Now, what we're going to see is that 65% of the population, 65% of the sample, the people that have had this research done, that we're assuming that will then apply to the population, but 65% is what your textbook says, so we'll go with that. 65% of individuals have a planum temporale that is larger in the left hemisphere than it is in the right hemisphere. The planum temporale is one of the areas of the cortex that's especially important for processing auditory information. So it would make sense if the majority of people have their language centers on the left side of the brain, that the auditory centers on the left side of the brain would be a little bit larger. So one question then might be, is it always this way, or is it that a person is exposed to speech and then because of that it starts to become larger, that kind of thing, new connections are formed? What we find is that this seems to be a biological thing rather than an environmental thing. So when they do imaging studies during pregnancy, you can see this, but within the first few months after birth as well, you can see the planum temporale is larger even before the individual has been exposed to a lot of speech. So because of that, it seems like it's more of a nature thing rather than a nurture thing. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture in a second, but just so you can see, this is the orientation of the cut they're making, so you can kind of know what you're looking at here. This is the way they're doing the dissection that they're showing in this next picture. Okay, so what we have here, we have the anterior, the posterior, so you know where you're facing. Okay. And we're looking at the auditory cortex. So the blue and yellow together are making the auditory cortex. Now, we're especially interested in the secondary because this yellow secondary here is the planum temporale that we were talking about a second ago. You can see that this is a picture of what we typically find, that it is substantially larger in the left hemisphere than it is in the right hemisphere. This is not going to be the case for all individuals. Some individuals, as you'll see later, will have language centers on both sides of the brain or on the right side of the brain. But for the majority of people, this is what we find. Now, when we're thinking about auditory areas, certainly thinking about language would be really important. A lot of what we hear is language. But what about other things that we hear that are not necessarily language? So what you find is that you do have auditory areas on the right side of your brain, even if your language center is on the left side of your brain. And the auditory areas on the right side of your brain do other things that are very important as well. Emotional tone of voice, you see the prosody here, that's just the term for that emotional tone of voice. So that tone that a person is using when they're speaking is more nonverbal. It's not the content of their words, but how they're saying what they're saying. That's going to be processed more on the right side of the brain, as well as music. Now, I'm just going to come clean with you guys. I have no musical skills whatsoever. There are people in my family. My brother plays guitar. My mom can play the piano and the organ. I have no musical skills whatsoever. So maybe I can blame it on something with my right hemisphere. So musical perception seems to be especially important for the right hemisphere because we can see that if a person has damage to the right hemisphere, then that will impair their musical perception. But it won't get rid of it completely. You have to have damage to both hemispheres to not be able to perceive music anymore. But it's harder to perceive music. You'll have less accuracy if you have damage to the right hemisphere. And that when people listen to music and we look to see what parts of the brain are active, the right hemisphere tends to be more active. Now, if we could have, I would like to have this conversation. If we were in class, I'd ask the question, do you think that your personal skills are something that you developed because you worked hard or something you're born with? For example, I would ask if any of you are musical. Maybe you can sing. I know some of you can sing. Some of you are in the choir and that kind of thing, or play music, play in the band, that kind of thing. Do you think that you're musical? For those of you who are, I am certainly not. Do you think that you're musical because you practiced and you work hard, or do you think perhaps you were born with this setup, maybe even a particular part of your brain that's a little bit more developed that has allowed for musical talent? Just something to think about. Now, my musical talent and my knowledge of musical terms are both pretty poor. So when I see perfect pitch here, I've looked up perfect pitch. I have not seen the movie Pitch Perfect. Maybe that's why I don't understand. But I still don't quite understand what this term. So then that means you don't really have to know what it means for the test, because I'm not going to write a test question that I don't understand. But perfect pitch, my understanding of it is that it has to do with being able to identify certain musical notes. That's as far as I can explain it. But apparently some people are able to do this really well. But perfect pitch is different from most musical issues, most musical talents, in that it's more associated with the left hemisphere than the right hemisphere. So then I suppose you'd have to use both your left and your right hemispheres to be an especially talented musician if having perfect pitch is associated with, I really don't know. I feel like I've had some students in the past tell me that they knew people who had perfect pitch but were not musical, and I just don't understand it well enough to know what that means, but I certainly don't have it, okay? Now, when they measured the planum temporale, which was that secondary auditory cortex, that yellow bit that we saw in the picture earlier, they found that it was largest in musicians with perfect pitch and smallest in non-musicians. And then musicians that did not have perfect pitch were somewhere in between. So perhaps the size of certain brain structures impacts talent, although I'd like to think that a person could potentially gain talent if they worked hard enough. But it's just not in the cards for me. All right, so what about handedness? I said earlier that about 90% of people are right-handed, about 10% of people are left-handed. Different studies show different numbers. One thought is that in the past there's been a stigma against left-handed people. So perhaps we thought there were fewer left-handed people because there was societal pressure for a person to be right-handed, and maybe now people don't feel that anymore. Once again, on the list of things I'm not great at, I'm also not athletic. But it seems to me that there are certain sports where being left-handed could be an advantage, like being a left-handed pitcher, perhaps, could be a good thing. I don't know. If we were in class, I'd have you guys help me out with this kind of thing, but I'm just going to have to do the best I can on my own. So, when I talked about the stigma against left-handed people, the word left-handed, is this in Latin? I'm trying to remember. I think it's Latin. It was sinistra, was the word for left-handed, which is where we get the word sinister from. Why did people think poorly of individuals who were left-handed? Well, you'll see that in a second. I'm just going to leave that right there. I'll come back to it. You'll see that in a second. But one thing I do want to say is that research does not suggest that there's any cognitive decline or issue in left-handed individuals. When they did research with left-handed children and right-handed children did not score significantly differently on measures of cognitive performance, so there's not a reason to have a stereotype against left-handed individuals, okay? Now, where does your handedness come from? That's, once again, a complicated thing that we don't completely understand. There does seem to be a genetic component. What we're going to find here, though, is that there is one gene that we think is related to handedness, one gene that contributes to being left-handed that also is associated with an increased risk of schizophrenia. So remember we talked about the glutamate hypothesis in chapter 16, about how individuals might have underactivation of glutamate and how that could cause symptoms of schizophrenia. Well, what we see is that individuals who are in a clinical population, so who are receiving treatment for a psychological disorder, tend to be a little bit more likely to be left-handed than the general population. And maybe part of that is because there is an association between being left-handed and having a higher risk of schizophrenia. But the risk is not that much higher. But perhaps if there was a stereotype that left-handed people were more likely to have psychological problems, then there's self-fulfilling prophecy, maybe people are mistreated, and maybe that could lead to those individuals having more psychological problems because of environmental things, not because of the person being left-handed. Okay, now, it's really interesting to do research in individuals who have the split brain condition, and it's interesting to do research in individuals who've had strokes and accidents. We're going to talk more about that coming up. But what if we wanted to do research on an individual who has a fully functioning brain? How could we do that? Well, the WADA test, once again, this is not something I can see myself signing up for. This idea sort of freaks me out, but it's also really cool. So what they're doing is they are anesthetizing, so they're numbing one hemisphere at a time. Essentially, they are simulating a stroke. So what they'll do is they'll numb one hemisphere and leave the other hemisphere functioning, and they'll have the person do a series of tasks. and then the anesthesia will wear off. It only lasts for a few minutes, and then they'll give them a little break, and they'll come back, and they'll do the anesthesia on the other side and have them do the tasks again and see what they can find. So once again, that's hard for me to imagine myself doing that, but let's take a look at what's happening in this particular picture. Okay, so if we have the right hemisphere anesthetized, so it's numb, it's almost like we've simulated a massive stroke on this side of the brain, then for the majority of people that won't impact their speech because their speech centers are on the left side of the brain. But you will have some symptoms that will come from having your right hemisphere numbed. One of those symptoms, not the only one, but one is that the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of your body, so you wouldn't be able to control your left arm, left leg, that kind of thing. Now, if you were one of those few individuals who has your language centers on the right side, then this would impact your language. Okay, so here's what we found with this particular type of research study, this WADA test. They found that for everyone, the language center was more likely to be on the left side. But for right-handed people, it's something like 90+% of right-handed people have their language centers on the left side. And then a few of them, the rest of them, had it on the right side. They, in this particular research study, did not have any individuals who had language centers on both sides. Now, with left-handed individuals, the left-handed individuals were still more likely to have their language centers on the left side. In this particular study, 70% of the participants did, but they had a higher proportion of individuals who had their language centers in the right hemisphere, and they had some that had language centers on both sides. So it seems like there's a little bit more flexibility in the brains of the left-handed individuals than we found in the right-handed individuals. Okay? Now, as we've said, the language centers are typically located on the left side, and those language centers are necessary for being able to produce speech, to understand speech. More on that coming up in a second. But we're also going to see some things that are, for most people, for the most part, are specialized in the right hemisphere. So we'll talk more about faces in just a second, but space, shapes, spatial reasoning, objects, so being able to follow a map, being able to solve nonverbal puzzles. So sometimes you'll have questions where it'll say, what would this shape look like if we rotated this? Or which of these pictures would come next in this series? That sort of thing has a right hemisphere advantage for most individuals. Okay? And when you have damage in that area, whether that be because we've numbed it with anesthesia in the WADA test, or if a person's had a stroke or an accident, then they're going to have symptoms that are related to spatial reasoning. Okay, now we're going to be talking about some disorders that can be related to damage in particular locations in the brain. These are relatively rare, but certainly interesting. We have small sample sizes for these, but what we're going to find is that if you damage the post-central gyrus, then that's going to produce sensory deficits on the opposite side. Okay, first of all, where is the post-central gyrus? So you have the central sulcus that is dividing the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, right? Reach way back to chapter 2. So the post-central gyrus is at the very front of the parietal lobe. So we're in the parietal lobe, but we're kissing the frontal lobe, okay, right up there. Now, if you have damage to this post-central gyrus on your left side of your brain, then you'll have sensory deficits on the right side of your body. And if you have damage to the post-central gyrus on the right side of your brain, then you'll have issues with sensory information on the left side of your body. Okay, so a stereognosis, love that, is the inability to recognize objects by touching and feeling them. So if a person has damage to their post-central gyrus on the right side of their brain, and you put something, an object, in their left hand, they would be able to feel it, but they wouldn't be able to identify what it was. You would probably be able to have a pretty decent guess at what this thing is in my hand, based on the feel of it. But if you take this object and put it in their right hand, assuming that their problem was only on the right side of their brain, then they might be able to do it. They might be able to recognize that object. And then if it was damaged on both sides, they wouldn't be able to recognize it in either hand. Okay, so this is difficulty being able to identify an object based only by touch. So we're not using sight and that kind of thing there. Prosopagnosia is the disorder that I mentioned briefly earlier, face blindness. So this is where individuals cannot recognize faces. Like, faces just don't mean anything to them, including their own faces. So these individuals look in the mirror and they don't recognize their own face, which is, once again, it's hard for me to imagine what that would be like. What happens here is that the fusiform gyrus is damaged. You're going to see a picture of this coming up where this is located. It talks to you about bilateral damage. So if you have a disorder like prosopagnosia that requires damage to the structures on both sides of the brain, that's going to be more rare because it's unlikely that you'll have damage to exact the same areas on both sides of your brain. So the fusiform gyrus on both sides of your brain. Certainly possible, but not as common. So something that requires bilateral damage is not going to be as common as something that only requires damage on one side. So what they did was they brought in individuals who were struggling with facial recognition. And what they did was they took a picture of the subject. So when it says self here, this is just the subject of the individual. And they have the celebrity, right? And they do a composite picture where they sort of morph the face of the participant with the face of the celebrity. And they ask you the question, do you recognize your face here? Is there something here? Who does this look like? Does it look like you or does it look like a celebrity? Now, for someone who has prosopagnosia, this will be really complicated for them, really difficult for them. Faces don't mean a whole lot. But what about individuals who are having the WADA test? So remember, with the WADA test, that's where we're using anesthesia to numb one hemisphere or the other. So when the left hemisphere was anesthetized, numbed, remember, if your left hemisphere is numbed, you're going to have problems with language, but you're not going to have as much of a problem with recognizing objects, faces, shapes, that kind of thing. So this individual has had their language centers anesthetized, but not their spatial centers. And they were able to see that there was something of themselves in this picture. They could recognize that, hey, that sort of looks like me. On the other hand, if your right hemisphere is anesthetized, so it's numb, we have your language center still working, but that right hemisphere that handles faces, spatial reasoning, etc. is numbed, then it was much harder for them to see themselves. They say, oh no, that's not me, that's a celebrity. There's nothing in there that looks like me. Okay, so the big picture idea here is that you need your right hemisphere. For the majority of people, that's where you would find this. You need your right hemisphere to help you recognize your own face as well as the faces of others. So here is that fusiform gyrus. I don't know why they only labeled it on one side. You have one of these on each side, so you can just sort of think about the other one over here. But that fusiform gyrus is that area that is important for recognizing faces. And if you have damage on both sides, then you're going to have a major issue with recognizing your own face as well as the faces of others. So we've known for a while that prosopagnosia can happen after an accident, surgery, stroke, etc. But what we've found is that there is such a thing as congenital prosopagnosia. So these individuals have not had a stroke, they've not had surgery, there's no type of brain damage that we can recognize, but they struggle with faces. And it's not that uncommon. I mean, 2.5%, 1% of the population has OCD. I am that 1%, right? But it looks like a lot more people than I would expect have this. So maybe you are that person, or you know that person that's just terrible with faces. It's possible you have some form. I mean, it's going to be more severe or less severe for different individuals. It could be other things too. I'm not trying to scare you or anything, but it is possible that it's because you have issues with your fusiform gyrus, okay? On the other hand, there are some people that are excellent with faces. My husband has a fantastic memory. He will just, and sometimes it's just problematic for me because he can win arguments because he can remember everything, but I cannot. On the other hand, thinking about memory, but some people can just recognize faces and remember faces, And you can think about how that could be a good thing. Your textbook talks about how there are some careers, maybe like a police officer, where being able to remember faces and recognize faces could be especially useful. Okay, now not the rest of, but a lot of the slides that we have left are going to focus on aphasias. We're going to be looking at individuals who have damage to particular areas of the brain and seeing how that tells us more about where our language centers are located. So an aphasia is an impairment in language ability caused by a brain injury. So a lot of the case studies on this have dealt with stroke, but it could be something else, could be an accident, etc. So when you have damage to your language centers, we're usually talking about on the left side of the brain. Remember that for the majority of people, the language centers are located on the left side of the brain. Now, what you're going to see is that a lot of people who have strokes have language-related symptoms. So it's not a bad idea to know some of the warning signs of stroke and know what that can look like. And one thing that you can see is that people can start slurring their speech or having a hard time understanding when you're talking to them. But then also they can continue to have these symptoms after the individual has started recovering from the stroke. So this can be a long-term symptom as well. Okay, as I said, this is usually because there's damage to the left hemisphere. It talks about 90 or 95%. What we're saying is pretty much all of the right-handed people and a good percent of the left-handed people have their language centers in the left hemisphere, and so when a person has damage to the brain that hurts their language centers, it's probably on the left side. Okay, now there are different types of aphasia that we're going to be talking about. Paraphasia is a less severe form. So a person who has a paraphasia, they may have some difficulty. They may have some words that they say that are a little bit odd, they're a little bit hard to follow, but they're able to communicate fairly well, especially compared with some of these other disorders that we're going to be talking about. So other things that can come up in individuals who have aphasia, neologisms, so the neo, like new words. So this is not something that's exclusive to aphasia. There are other disorders, schizophrenia is one, but other disorders where a person might make up words that don't make sense to you, or maybe words you haven't heard before. And then also some types of aphasia, and we'll talk about this more in a second, but it's going to be Broca's aphasia, involve a considerable effort in being able to speak. So the person understands when you talk to them if they have Broca's aphasia, which we'll see in a second. But it's very difficult for them to speak back, and they're not able to have that normal flow of conversation like a typical individual would. If you have an aphasia, you may also show other impairments as well. So it talks about agraphia, which is difficulty with writing, alexia, an inability to read. We're going to talk more about reading disorders later in the lecture. Apraxia, a motor impairment in the ability to begin and execute voluntary movements. So you could think about something like cutting with scissors or tying your shoes, something that involves a skilled movement. And it's not a problem because of muscle paralysis. It's hard to explain exactly where the problem has come from, but this is a symptom that can show up in an individual who has an aphasia. So there's a few areas here that are especially important to point out. This is Broca's area here. You're going to hear me talk about Broca's area. This is the area that, as you'll see, that's important for producing speech. And then we have Wernicke's area, which is associated with Wernicke's aphasia. Wernicke's area is going to be important for comprehending speech. And then, auditory area is important. We talked a little bit about that earlier. You're going to need your motor cortex to be able to move your mouth, to be able to form words. The angular gyrus is going to come back up later as well, so we'll talk more about that there. So I have this table here, and then I also have this table later. It's the same table, but we're going to be talking about different types of aphasia. So I thought this could be good to have this table up to start our conversation of aphasia, and then to have it up to review our conversation of aphasia as well. I'm going to do like I did in my last video. If we were having this lecture in class, it would be split over 2 class days. This is probably where I would stop lecture on a Tuesday, and we'd pick it back up on Thursday. So if you want to pause the video, take a break, get some rest, do something, give yourself a brain break, then now would be a good time to do that. Of course, you don't have to do that, but just a suggestion. Alright, so hopefully you guys took a bit of a break there. So we're going to start talking more detail about different types of aphasia. So subcortical aphasia is not one that we're really going to touch on much, but we will talk about Broca's and Wernicke's aphasias, as well as global aphasia and conduction aphasia. And then we'll come back and see this table again and sort of use it as a review. So first of all, Broca's aphasia is named after Dr. Paul Broca, who had this particular patient whose name I would butcher if I tried to pronounce it, so I'm not even going to try, an individual who had had a brain injury and was only able to produce the sound tan. That's the only thing that he could say. Now, this individual and other cases that had similar symptoms led Paul Broca to the assertion that maybe there's a particular part of the brain that's important for producing speech, and that the brain injury had damaged that area. So after the individuals passed away, he was able to do autopsies and identified this particular location that would come to be known as Broca's area that seemed to be especially important for producing speech. So Broca's area is located in the inferior frontal lobe, so the bottom part of the frontal lobe towards the parietal lobe there. You saw a picture of where it was earlier, right? So Broca's area is especially important for being able to produce speech. So if someone has damage to this area, it's called Broca's aphasia or non-fluent aphasia. So what happens in non-fluent aphasia or Broca's aphasia is that the individual knows what he or she wants to say, but has great difficulty producing that speech. And not just producing speech, but also writing, that kind of thing. However, they have good comprehension when someone is talking to them. So this leads us to suggest that perhaps there's two different brain centers. There's going to be one center that produces speech and one center that comprehends speech. Because if Broca's area was doing both, then a person who had Broca's aphasia would not only have difficulty producing speech, but they'd also have difficulty comprehending speech. So when they looked at autopsies of individuals who had Broca's aphasia, they found that they had damage to this area in the frontal lobe, and that is what led us to the belief that that area was important for the production of speech. Now, Wernicke's area, and it's spelled a W, it's German, I believe it's Wernicke's. Wernicke's area is located, you usually think about it as being in the temporal lobe, but there can be part of the parietal lobe that's involved as well. So this is the area that is important for production of speech. It is important for the production of speech, but it's especially important for the perception of speech. That's what I really want you to focus here. So being able to understand when someone is speaking to you. So if a person had Broca's aphasia, they'd have damage to Broca's area, they'd have a difficult time producing speech, but they would be able to comprehend speech. Someone who has Wernicke's aphasia has damage to Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe and possibly in part of the parietal lobe as well. And when they have Wernicke's aphasia or fluent aphasia, they have the most difficulty with comprehending speech. So they can't understand what you're saying to them. The reason it's called fluent aphasia is that they're able to produce speech well. They don't have a problem producing speech. The difficulty is that the speech is hard to understand. So there may be made-up words in there, sound substitutions, word substitutions. So because of that, it's extremely difficult to follow a person who has Wernicke's aphasia, and they will probably have a difficult time following what you're saying as well. So, as we said, with fluent aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia, we're saying they're speaking fluently, but not clearly communicating their meaning. They're saying a lot of nonsense sounds and words fluently, but there's not a lot of meaning in what they're saying, and they have a hard time comprehending what you're saying as well. They can also have difficulty with reading. So this is showing a large difficulty with comprehending language, whether it's spoken or written. Word deafness versus word blindness. If you look at these terms, word deafness would refer to the difficulty in understanding language that they're hearing. And so that might suggest that there's an issue with the connections to the auditory cortex. They're hearing language, and that's a struggle for them. And then word blindness, just like it suggests, is that they're having difficulty being able to read or understand words that they're seeing, and so this may result from damage to the angular gyrus, which you'll see a picture of this. You already saw one picture of it. It was in the diagram that had Broca's area and Wernicke's area, but I feel like there may be another one coming up anyway. But the angular gyrus is towards the back of the brain, and it seems to be especially important for when a person is reading. You can also see anomia, where the person has a difficult time thinking of the name for persons and objects. So there are videos out there. If you're interested, you could find videos of people who have Wernicke's aphasia, and they'll hold up an object and they'll ask them to name it, and they're able to speak fluidly, but the words they're saying don't make a lot of sense, and it sounds like they're just making up words for the objects that you're holding up. Okay. So with Broca's aphasia, the individual has difficulty producing speech. With Wernicke's aphasia, the individual has difficulty comprehending speech. With global aphasia, it's pretty much all of the issues with language that a person can have. So global aphasia is rare because it requires damage to a very large area. Usually in the left hemisphere, because most people have their language centers in the left hemisphere. But if your language centers are in the right hemisphere, this could be in the right hemisphere. But for the most part, left hemisphere, large areas of damage. So once again, if it's a disorder that requires large areas of damage, or areas of damage on both sides of the brain, that's going to be less common. Your textbook gives an example of an individual who had global aphasia, and she lost the ability to use the 6 languages that she knew. I can't imagine. I know a tiny bit of French, left over from my college days. I know some Latin. I'm learning Latin with my kids, but I'm not really fluent in any language but English, and that's only when I've had enough caffeine that I'm fluent in English. But the idea is that she lost all language ability, and this is going to happen only when there's damage to large portions of whichever hemisphere contains your language areas. So, taking all this information into account, there are lots of different viewpoints on how language happens. Remember that in biological psychology, a lot of our information that we know comes from studying where people have had damage, where things have gone wrong, and then making models based off of that to try to apply to the general population. So first of all, Wernicke, from Wernicke's area, Wernicke proposed this connectionist model of aphasia, okay? And there is some evidence for and some evidence against this. We don't have the perfect model yet. The connectionist model of aphasia, just like it sounds, says that you have language issues when you have damage to one of your language areas, or if you have damage to the connections between the language areas, right? So we need Broca's area to work, we need Wernicke's area to work, but we also need the connection between Broca's area and Wernicke's area to work, and that it's a circuit, and that damage anywhere in that circuit can cause symptoms of aphasia. So the arcuate fasciculus, that's a fun one, is very important for this connectionist model, and the reason why it's so important is because the arcuate fasciculus is, now focus on this may, a bundle of axons that may connect Wernicke's area to Broca's area. So Wernicke's connectionist model here says, okay, there is an area, structure that is connecting Wernicke's area and Broca's area. So that points to this connectionist model, that you have to have not just Broca's area working and Wernicke's area working, but the connection between them working, and the supposed connection is this arcuate fasciculus. So they found this bundle of axons that seemed like it connected Wernicke's area and Broca's area, and if you damage those axons, then the individual develops conduction aphasia, another type of aphasia. So here's an individual that has a functioning Broca's area, functioning Wernicke's area, but the arcuate fasciculus is damaged, so the connection between Broca's and Wernicke's areas is damaged. This produces conduction aphasia, where the person is not able to repeat the words that they've heard. They can understand what you're saying to them, and they can produce their own speech, but they cannot replicate the speech that they heard you say. I understood what you said, and I can say what I want to say, but I can't repeat what you said to me. So this is taken as evidence for the connectionist model, which, I mean, the connectionist model makes sense to a certain extent. We'll talk about that in a second. So, as I've said, kind of as a summary, Broca's aphasia, the person has a difficult time producing speech, but they're able to comprehend pretty well. With Wernicke's aphasia or fluent aphasia, the person is able to produce speech fluidly, but that speech doesn't make a lot of sense, and they have a difficult time comprehending what they're hearing or reading often as well. Global aphasia happens from large areas of damage on usually the left hemisphere, and this can cause significant symptoms, a difficulty in producing speech as well as a difficulty in understanding speech. With conduction aphasia, you have a functioning Broca's area, so the person can produce speech. You have a functioning Wernicke's area, so the person can comprehend speech, but there's damage to the arcuate fasciculus, and therefore the person has a difficult time in repeating a sound that they just heard. You don't need to worry about subcortical aphasia. Okay, so then, how do we view this connectionist model of aphasia when looking at different tasks? First of all, speaking a heard word. So you're repeating something you heard someone else say. Okay, first the information has to come into your auditory cortex, right? You've got to hear the word. Then the word you heard has to go to Wernicke's area so you can understand the word you heard. Okay, then that information needs to go from Wernicke's area, where you comprehended it, across the arcuate fasciculus, which is the believed connection, the supposed connection between Wernicke's area and Broca's area. And so we go over to Broca's area, which is where we're able to produce speech, which is what we want because we're trying to repeat that word. And then finally, we have to use that motor cortex to help us move our mouth in the appropriate way to produce that sound. Okay, now, it doesn't seem like a series of steps to you, assuming you don't have an aphasia. It's pretty natural and easy to repeat a word that you're hearing somebody else say, especially if it's a young child and a curse word. Very easy for them to repeat that. Okay, what about naming a scene, object, or word? So reading a word or looking at an object and naming it, so you're not hearing it, you're seeing it. Okay. This is going to require visual information, so instead of that auditory cortex, we're going to have the visual cortex, and we're also going to have that angular gyrus. We mentioned the angular gyrus earlier as being important for happening with word blindness, a person who has that symptom of aphasia where they have a difficult time reading. So the angular gyrus is important for processing visual information that's related to language. If you have damage in this area, then you're going to have issues with being able to read. So the person may be able to speak, they can produce speech, they can understand speech, but if there's damage in like the angular gyrus, for example, then they'll have a difficult time reading aloud. So here's this process. Now we're trying to read a written word out loud. So we have our visual cortex, that's important for seeing the word. And then that information is sent to the angular gyrus next. So if there's damage here, that's going to be difficult for a person to be able to read that word out loud. Then we go to Wernicke's area, where we're going to really comprehend the word and send that on to Broca's area, where we are able to produce the word we're going to say out loud. And then we go to that motor cortex where we are moving our mouth and tongue, etc., in the right way to produce that. So this is what's happening when we're seeing a word written down and we're speaking it out loud. Once again, several steps that happen very quickly and naturally unless you have some type of aphasia. So that's kind of the model for the connectionist view. However, the Wernicke-Geschwind model, which is the connectionist model, has some issues with it. Perhaps it's a little too simple. This is biological psychology. Nothing's ever simple. It'd be nice if it was every once in a while. What they did was they used a type of imaging to actually look at that arcuate fasciculus. Now remember, the arcuate fasciculus was a crucial component of that connectionist model because it is the connection. It's the connection between Wernicke's area and Broca's area. So it's really where this whole model rests, is this arcuate fasciculus. What they found is that the arcuate fasciculus for most people comes close to Broca's area, but doesn't actually connect to Broca's area. So that throws a wrench in the connectionist model. However, Conduction aphasia is still evidence for the connectionist model, because if you damage the arcuate fasciculus, the person has a difficult time repeating words. So we don't know for sure. One other theory to mention here, this motor theory of language, suggests that language is really just a complex motor skill, that you have to hold your tongue, your lips, your mouth in a certain position. You have to be able to move them in a certain position to produce speech, and that children learn how to imitate, or they learn how to speak by imitating the sounds that they hear. My toddler, his favorite word is moo. He's almost 20 months old. He'll be 20 months old next week. He can say probably 10-ish words with any regularity. Maybe more than that, but something like that. But his favorite word is moo, and I just love the way he holds his mouth. I just wish you could see my little child like moo, like he does this very exaggerated lip pucker. So I'm thinking about the motor skills in language, makes me think about my son Brandon. But anyway, so what we're saying here is that when you're producing speech, you have to use these complex motor skills. But when you're trying to understand someone else's speech, you're trying to perceive their complex motor skills. So looking at language as being both a production and a perception of motor skills. So one way to think about it. Another thing that's interesting is that language is language, regardless of the type of language, and actually sign language falls into that category we talked about earlier. It has the component parts that you put together to make a wide variety of words that you can communicate lots of information in, and they're arbitrary symbols that are made up. I mean, sign language is a language. So what they find is that for individuals who use sign language, if they have damage on their left hemisphere, assuming that their language centers in the left hemisphere, then they will have symptoms that are very similar to aphasia in speaking individuals and hearing individuals. So they'll have difficulty understanding the sign language of other people, or difficulty producing sign language. So language is essentially the take-home message there. So a little bit more about speech and reading in particular. Your activity for this week, activity 12, which you only have to complete if you need more activity points. I'm going to drop your 2 lowest activity grades. So if you haven't used your activity drop grades, then you can do that. You don't have to do activity 12. But activity 12 asks about your thoughts on environmental factors that are important for reading, because we're going to talk more about biological factors here. So talking a little bit more about language. All language has the same basic elements. So phonics is the tried and true way of teaching reading. There are other ways of teaching reading, but the research really supports the use of phonics, and that's been my go-to in teaching my kids. Look, I tell you guys, I have a master's degree, you know, I've done some stuff, but teaching my kids how to read is the thing I'm probably most proud of. That my 2 older kids can read really well. My youngest one, yeah, he's 20 months. We're about to be 20 months. We're working on it. But yeah, teaching them how to read is just a mom moment. Phonemes, basic speech sounds. So A says ah, and B says b, that kind of thing. Morpheme is going to be a unit of meaning. So this could be a word, but it could also be like a prefix or a suffix, something that you add to a word that gives it meaning. So a unit of meaning would be a morpheme. And then semantics is going to refer to the meanings. So you think about like vocabulary, that kind of thing. Syntax is going to be more about how we construct phrases and sentences, the appropriate place to put certain words, etc., etc. So what we find is that assuming there's not a biological problem, babies are born with the ability to distinguish phonemes from any language, because baby doesn't know what language baby's going to need. So you're born with a brain that could learn any language. But what happens is that you will learn to speak the language that is spoken to you. So yes, when I got pregnant the first time, I remember telling my husband, like, we've got to learn another language so we can teach the baby. And then I didn't start teaching them Latin for another 8 years. But anyway, the idea is that you have a sensitive period for language. A sensitive period means this is the ideal time for you to learn something, to acquire some new skill. So the first few years of life are really that sensitive period. And so it's pretty easy, assuming that there's not a a biological problem, it's pretty easy to teach a child how to speak. Just speaking to them, reading to them, that kind of thing, being around language, they'll learn how to speak. What we see is that individuals will speak the language that is spoken to them, so they will lose this ability. This ability to easily distinguish, to understand, to produce these sounds, you lose that after a while. It's like pruning the things that are unnecessary so that you can specialize. Your brain says, oh, okay, we're only going to hear one language, so we're going to specialize on that one language. So if an individual is in a terrible abuse, neglect situation, and they're not exposed to language by around age 7 or so, that individual may not be able to produce language. That sensitive period may have passed, and it may be too late for that particular person. All right, now, I talked about the fact that language is something that's usually relatively easy to grasp, unless the person has a biological disorder. Now, I'm just going to rant. It's just give me 1 minute to rant here, okay? I don't like the fact that your textbook uses the term dyslexia. Your textbook uses it, and so I left it in the slides because that's what your textbook says, but I don't like the fact that your textbook uses dyslexia because the DSM doesn't use dyslexia. So the DSM is our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're on version 5 right now. The DSM has the term specific learning disorder with impairment in, and then it's whatever you have impairment in. So you can have specific learning disorder with impairment in math, or specific learning disorder with impairment in reading. That's what we're talking about here. So dyslexia is not the term that's used by the DSM, and so it's not a term that I use ever unless I'm teaching this lecture, because that's what your textbook uses. So just be aware that I'm irked by this, okay? I digress. Not that particular matter, but it's not in the DSM. Just anyway, dyslexia or specific learning disorder with impairment in reading. It just doesn't roll off the tongue. It's a long name. Anyway, we have some type of biological impairment here. So this is something that's often present from birth or from an early age. You may not realize it until an individual is struggling with reading at a certain point. It is possible that an individual could develop reading skills typically and then have some type of injury, and that can cause them to have difficulty in reading. That would be something that is acquired later in life through an injury, but for the most part, when we're talking about dyslexia or specific learning disorder with impairment in reading, I'm just saying, we're talking about an individual who has had this issue since birth. So there are different types of dyslexia. It talks here about deep dyslexia, where an individual reads a word as another semantically related word. So it is difficult for them to read out loud and read exactly what's on the page. They change words frequently, and although the words they use may be related words, if you change enough words over time, you have a different meaning to whatever it is that you're trying to read. On the other hand, with surface dyslexia, an individual can understand meaning, perhaps, but their issue is more with the phonics. So the specific letter, then the sounds that goes with them can be difficult for them. There are lots of different things that I've heard from people who have reading disorders. My dad was diagnosed with dyslexia, so he has a reading disorder. And I say dyslexia because that's what they told him and that's what he calls it, but you know what I think about what it's supposed to be called. But anyway, one thing that he said is that it's very difficult for him to read because it's hard for him to follow like in a straight line. It seems like his eyes kind of wander off down the page, and so he has to use like a bookmark or piece of paper to like cover up everything except for the particular bit he's trying to read. So there can be a lot of symptoms that can go along with it. It can be especially difficult when you look at the letter to sound rules and they're irregular. I don't know if you've noticed how weird our language is until you try to teach another person to read it or write it. But one, like the number one, I'm sure there's a reason that the number one is pronounced one and spelled O-N-E, but it doesn't make sense because, so anyway, when you start teaching or paying attention to that, you'll see that there are a lot of irregular words that are not really phonetic. So what about languages that are perfectly phonetic? I know no Italian, although I have to assume that Italian probably has a large Latin component, and I have noticed that Latin tends to be a little more, seems to me anyway, with my very limited knowledge of Latin, seems to be more phonetic. But your textbook says that Italian is a perfectly phonetic language, and therefore it seems to produce less difficulty with reading. So perhaps it's just that our language really is that complicated. I've always heard that English is one of the more complicated languages. All right. So it talks here about developmental dyslexia that is showing up in those early years, occurring in about 5% of the general population. Certainly this number could be wrong. There may be a lot of cases where an individual is not being assessed or not being properly diagnosed. There may be some cases that are diagnosed as dyslexia that really may be another disorder, but this is the estimate that we have. So dyslexia seems to be a biological issue. You can see issues with arrangements of cortical cells. So remember in our development lecture about how these neural cells are being produced in that ventricular zone, and then they're migrating out to the correct location. So perhaps some of the cells did not migrate in the correct order, the arrangement's not quite right. Micropolygyria, all the fun terms today. An excessive number of gyri, or that's the foldings that you have there. So you can have excessive folding in some areas of the brain. Also, you can have these clusters of cells that seem to be in unusual places. This is kind of indicating that the cells are not migrating correctly. So when you look at functional MRI in an individual who has a reading disorder, what you can see is diminished activation of the left posterior regions. Okay, that makes sense. All of that makes sense. Think about it. The left side of the brain for almost everyone has the language centers, and we talked about the structures towards the back of the brain, the angular gyrus being especially important for reading. So when you think about that, it makes sense that there would be diminished activation in those areas. Now, one thing I will say is that just because there is a biological basis for reading disorders does not mean that this individual cannot learn how to read. It's that they may need more intensive one-on-one tutoring, they may need different incentives to read, they may need different ways of instruction, but we need to make sure that we have appropriate expectations that are not too high, not too low, because we often get what we expect out of kids, out of anyone, really. Okay. So also what we're going to see is that there may be some changes in the connection between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. So it talks about the white matter pathways between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe. So perhaps there's an issue there. Remember that we talked about brain structures, especially on the left side, being in the temporal area and the parietal area, and so perhaps the language-related areas are not appropriately connected to each other. That kind of harkens back to that connectionist model, the arcuate fasciculus kind of situation. Maybe there are issues there. Okay, so what we're saying is that in order to be able to read, you have to be able to understand the phonics to sound out the word, and you need to be able to understand what the word means. And then, of course, in a larger scale, what does the paragraph mean? What does the page mean? So when we're talking about the sounds of letters, we're talking about phonology. That would refer to phonics. On the other hand, when we're talking about the meaning of words, we're referring to semantics. So there may be some individuals who have reading disorders that struggle with the phonic side of things. Some may struggle with the semantic side of things, or could potentially be issues with both. All right, last little bit here, we're talking about issues with individuals who've had some type of injury. They've had an accident, they've had surgery, they've lost some type of functioning. Will they get it back? Well, it depends on a lot of different things. Oftentimes, there is at least some level of recovery. If the individual has the damage earlier in life, that usually bodes better for them. It talks here about recovery after brain damage being better than recovery after a stroke. Maybe that has to do with a stroke cutting off blood supply to certain areas of the brain, that kind of thing. So it depends on the type of trauma, it depends on the age, it depends on, the general health of the individual, those kinds of things. But many individuals are able to recover at least some of their language abilities. Now, if we're thinking about the brain's amazing ability to bounce back, I don't think you're going to find anything more impressive than a hemispherectomy. So a hemispherectomy is a surgery where you remove all of or most of one of the hemispheres. Your textbook has a bit about a case study with a girl. I think it was a 7-year-old girl. You'll see the picture in a second. A 7-year-old girl that had a severe seizure issue, and they had tried so many different things and nothing was working for her, and so they made the decision at age 7 to remove a large portion of one of her hemispheres. Now, of course there can be side effects with that. If you, for example, remove the right hemisphere, you're going to have issues with paralysis on the left side of your body. If you have removed portions that are important for language, you're going to have speech loss. You can have visual issues, etc. Having said all of that, it is certainly possible that the individual will bounce back if you have the surgery early enough. It talks about hemispherectomy happening early, and the child can show almost complete recovery. So you can see situations where an individual would go on to have average or maybe even above average intelligence, like on an IQ test, that kind of thing, language abilities. So if you have this surgery early on, the brain recognizes that something's not right here. We need to try to compensate for this. We need to be more flexible in which parts of the brain are handling which tasks. And the brain can actually respond really well. Now, this is for a young child. The younger the better as far as that's concerned. It would be very difficult for an adult brain to bounce back because we don't have the same level of neurogenesis and flexibility, neuroplasticity happening later. So what's happening here is, yeah, they have removed this hemisphere, essentially. And this is a 7-year-old girl, which hits me especially hard because my daughter is 7 years old. But what they've done here is save her life. She had, severe seizures. And the idea that you can remove the part of the brain that's causing the seizures actually worked out pretty well from her. She was able to recover. Of course, she had some symptoms right after surgery, paralysis, speech issues, but she did much better later. She was able to recover some of that. So that's just always amazing for me. So as I said, it's better if that kind of thing happens earlier in life. It's much easier for a child's brain to bounce back from injury or from surgery than it is for an adult's brain. However, even in adulthood, you do still maintain some of that neuroplasticity. It's not as much, but you can still recover to a certain extent. So it talks here about how damaged neurons can regrow their connections. Connections are continuing to form throughout your life. It's just a little bit more difficult for an adult brain to do it. And of course, when we're talking about something like stroke, we often, this can happen in young children, but it's very rare. We're often thinking about that happening in older individuals, and they can often recover at least some level of function. Now, we're not going to go into any great detail about the different types of therapies that are involved. I will mention a couple of them. It talks here about constraint-induced movement therapy. So this is the idea that a person has lost the use of one of their limbs. Maybe the right hand is functioning, but the left hand is very weak. Maybe they had a stroke on the right side of the brain, and so the left hand is weak. So what they do is they ask the individual to do a task, but they constrain the healthy limb. You'll see a picture of this in a second, so that they can only use the affected limb. And it seems relatively simple, just sort of forcing them to use it, but it can restore a good bit of function. So here's a picture of this individual. So this man has his right hand in this glove that's going to prevent him from using it. So the right hand would be his healthy hand, the left hand would be the one that was affected by whatever stroke, injury, etc. And so he's doing a task with these rings with his left hand, and something as simple as that can produce really good effects. Last thing here, I think this is the last slide, talking about using a mirror. It's sort of like we're tricking our brain here. So placing a mirror in a particular position so that the individual is only able to see their good arm, and so they can't see the arm that's struggling, and then ask them to do symmetrical motions, and they can only see the arm that's doing well, and somehow that seems to cause the brain to do better with the other arm. Although we can't completely understand how this works, the brain is an amazing thing, and it can bounce back quite a bit. Alright, so that is the end of biological psychology. Congratulations. That is all the information we're going to cover. I am planning on doing a brief review video for Exam 4 like I did for Exam 3, but that's all the new information. So don't forget to complete Activity 12. If you need more activity points, email me if you have questions about that. Also, the extra credit for Exam 4 is available now, and then Exam 4 is going to open on April 13th. And it's going to be open until the end of the final exam period for your section. So refer back to my beginning of this lecture video, the announcements there, to see exactly when it will close. But I'm sure I'll send out emails as well. I enjoyed teaching this class, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. Just let me know if you need anything, and I hope to have the opportunity to teach you guys again in the future. Take care.